Welcome to the upstreamlife.com. I'm your host and founder, Vishal Krishna. On today's podcast, we'll try to merge science and business. We'll try to do our best. The subject we're going to be discussing is water electrolysis. What is water electrolysis? Okay, definition. Water electrolysis is an electrochemical process of water splitting into gaseous hydrogen and oxygen. Okay, let me say why it's important. The renewable energy grid is integrated with water electrolysis systems, which makes green hydrogen production feasible in an eco-friendly and sustainable way. Renewable energy storage in the form of hydrogen via water electrolysis is a key technology in next generation energy carriers and conversion. So why is this important again? Decarbonizing economies like the US, China, you talk about all these large economies. They require massive upscaling of renewable power to meet the global increase of fossil-free electricity and to produce green hydrogen to substitute fossil fuels in hard-to-abate activities. We'll discuss that further with my guest, and let's find out what it is. I'm going to introduce my guest. It's Marty Neese, of course, the CEO of Verdagy. He will tell us why water electrolysis technology matters and why it's built for very large-scale production of green hydrogen. Verdagy, by the way, is creating a new category of high-performance cells, electrolysers, and plants. Verdagy's solutions achieve both the lowest upfront capital costs and the lowest unit economics for production. I'm not a science guy. Marty is not a science guy, but we're going to try our best to answer all your questions. Okay. Hi, Marty. Welcome to the Upstream Life. How are you?
I'm doing well. And yourself, Michelle?
Well, I'm really well, but all this technology talk really impresses me, and it has to happen out of the Bay Area, and you're in the Bay Area, of course. I want to ask you, firstly, what is green hydrogen? I've heard of gray and blue hydrogen. They come out of fossil fuels. But what is green hydrogen? If you tell us a little bit about that and a little bit about Verdagy, then let's get into the podcast.
Sure. So green hydrogen basically means that you're using green energy as the input source. So electrolysis is, as you would expect, it means water split by electrochemical processing using electricity. So electricity, if it's grid powered or if it's, let's say, CO2 intensive on the way in, it doesn't help that much to produce hydrogen using, let's just call it fossil fuels, for lack of a better term. And today, just to give you an idea, about let's say 98% of all the hydrogen produced for industry in the world today is produced using grid power or CO2 intensive power. So green energy or green hydrogen is where you use solar, wind, hydro. You use green energy inputs to basically split water into hydrogen and oxygen. And the hydrogen is considered green on the other side of that.
Yeah, that's a very nice answer, but it applies to industry, and our consumers of this technology are industry. Can you talk about how is it all Verdagy is solving for industry and why it matters? It's very clear that it's important to go green, use renewable energy, to produce hydrogen. And what are some of the applications? What are some of the opportunities by working with Verdagy?
Yeah, so you need look no further than our investor base. So we've got lead investors in the petrochemical industry, the industrial chemicals industry, the mining industry, and the energy infrastructure industries. You take those together, those are extraordinarily large industries that are hydrogen intensive in some of their applications, but that hydrogen today is produced largely through steam methane reforming, which basically produces 10 times more CO2 than it produces hydrogen. So clearly, if they want to continue their growth and industrial expansion, if you will, they do so at the expense of producing more CO2. We can reverse that paradigm, and that's what Verdagy is seeking to do, is give them an alternative that's economical. So heretofore, steam methane reforming has been the choice because it's the cheapest. Just like solar 15 years ago was not the choice because it wasn't the cheapest. Now, 15 years later, solar is your choice because it's cheaper than fossil fuels. The exact same thing is going to happen in green hydrogen. And we're innovating a technological platform that makes it so those industries can adopt electrolyzers, green hydrogen electrolysis, because it'll be cheaper and it'll be in their best interest. And it will be super compelling for them to improve their financials while simultaneously decarbonizing.
You know, I've been covering automobile for a very long period of time, and a lot of these German companies do have, hydrogen in their hydrogen fuel cells in their presentations. And they talk about an era where, this is going to happen between 2030 and 35. Yes, that's some time away, but the need of the hour is industry, right? So can you tell us some of the industries that use green hydrogen and why? We already answered why we have to move away from fossil fuels. I get that. But what are some of the industries that have moved fast into using hydrogen, green hydrogen?
Yeah, so the guys that are moving the quickest are sort of the guys that have the most experience with hydrogen already. So petrochemicals has a long history of using hydrogen for cracking, let's say molecule cracking, if you will, in their refining operations. So they know how to handle hydrogen. They're not afraid of it. They're decades into using hydrogen safely. So, many people think, oh, hydrogen, they think Hindenburg, they think of some strange image of like hydrogen is really hard to deal with from a safety standpoint. Well, not for a petrochemical company that's been doing it for decades. The same can be said of industrial chemicals. So if you're in the ethylene business or the vinyls business, you've been producing chemicals to support those industries for decades using electrolysis. And one of the byproducts of that electrolysis is hydrogen. So again, 50, 60, 70 years of experience doing high volume production of chlorine, if you will, or other gases with hydrogen as a co-byproduct. So these are industries that have deep safety experience. They have depth of understanding of hydrogen and all of its manifestations of how to handle it, how to move it, how to compress it, store it, distribute it. So these are the guys that are moving first, and they're moving big. So you'll see like the industrial chemicals sector, you'll see green ammonia as an announcement again and again and again. And that's just a natural extension of some industries that are already adapted to hydrogen production.
Okay, you said petrochemicals, right? I mean, and they're basically fossil fuel companies. And how do they use green hydrogen? If you can just, for most of my audience are also technology guys in software, and where I am, I have to admit that there are a lot of software engineers who are going to watch this too, right? Yeah. They want to know how does a petrochemical company apply hydrogen in its plants? You can answer that.
Yeah. I can't speak to I don't know every plant in petrochemicals, but I understand hydrocarbon cracking requires a significant amount of thermal heat, if you will. So they're looking to replace that natural gas heat with hydrogen heat, one for one. So they'll just be able to substitute green hydrogen for natural gas. And therein allows them to, let's say, continue their cracking operations with high heat. The other thing that they're looking at is, okay, let's say that you're producing green hydrogen at a really attractive price point. If you can compress, store, and distribute it, back to your fuel cell example, you can replace other fuels with hydrogen and decarbonize those as well. So let's say long haul trucking today is completely dependent on diesel. Over time, diesel engines will be replaced by combos of battery and fuel cell, not one or the other, but probably combinations of the two. And then they need fuel. So that fuel could then be green hydrogen. And so you can imagine in the very near term, and I mean in our lifetimes, the diesel trucking industry, in my view, will go away, and it'll be long haul trucking will be fuel cells and green hydrogen. That's in my lifetime. So
it's so interesting, right? Energy demand is increasing, and most of the economies want to decarbonize. There is a suggestion that everybody wants to make this planet a better world by 2050. And make sure that the temperatures are stable and they're not rising. For those of you watching this, I can only tell you that green hydrogen is not like coal and oil, where the only thing that it emits is water vapor, and leaves no residue in the air, right? That's the advantage, right? Okay, Marty, how did you come in association with Verdagy? Okay, and I want to know a little bit about Verdagy. How did the electrolyzer technology come about for Verdagy at that point in time, maybe 3-4 years now? And what are some of the early moves that you made in industry in the US and other parts of the world?
Yeah, so I mentioned the chlor-alkali industry. So there was a company called Chemetry, and Chemetry was working in Moss Landing, California over the past 10 years to decarbonize the industrial chemical space. Specifically, and I'm going to sound like I know what I'm talking about, but I don't, ethylene dichloride and propylene oxide, which are constituent ingredients of vinyls making. So what they did was Chemetry, the company, had been working on a process that significantly reduced the carbon intensity of producing those EDC and PO ingredients. Okay. That required very large electrochemical cells using membranes. So the aha moment for that team was they started doing a demonstration plant in Brazil for the Chemetry technology, but then they recognized that there was an applicable complementary marketplace right next door that was just expanding like crazy. And the interest level was going through the roof, which was green hydrogen. So they took that technology, basically very large electrochemical cells running at high current density, using membranes that had heretofore not been used. And they said, can we produce hydrogen with this? And the answer was yes. Then they, Chemetry, the founder, went and approached Khosla Ventures to do a spin out. And that happened in May of 2021 in Moss Landing, California. So I showed up in May of 2021 as the last employee in and helped take a team, lab assets, a mature pilot plant, technology that had been evolving for a decade, and then launched the company with seed funding, and then just went crazy after that.
And the craziness has been a lot of funds are after Verdagy at this point of time. You've been talking to some stellar funds. TDK Ventures is part of it as well. Yeah. What's been the amount of investment that you've raised for this? I mean, technology, has it been deployed in the US as well at this point in time?
It has been deployed only in Moss Landing in California at our pilot plant. So we raised a seed round, that was part of the spin out. Then we raised an A round, and that was a $25 million raise. And to your point, that had people like Shell, Orbia, BHP, Caterpillar, TDK, Temasek, Khosla, and Doral. So these are like 8 really, really significant players in their respective areas. And they've been fantastic partners for us. They've helped us open doors and use cases in both the US and in Europe for petrochemicals, industrial chemicals, mining, which is really steel if you think about it, and then energy infrastructure, which would be integrating hydrogen into existing natural gas pipelines. And that's where we've come from. And now we're raising additional capital to keep on our journey and to keep expanding our capability. And that's internationally, as well as to increase our own capabilities to manufacture electrolyzers at scale.
Okay. Do you think the US being in California, and obviously, do you see the US or US companies using this faster than your international markets, or is it the other way around? I'm really interested because when I look at all these green energy forums, some economies, want to move slower towards the sustainability route. Some people, they think the sustainability route is possible in many other technologies. But do you see barriers in the US itself? I want to ask you this because you have two fossil fuel companies that have invested in you, which basically mean, and they're European companies mostly. That means, do you see Europe move faster than the US? What's your worldview on this? I mean, how's the world going to move with all the geopolitics happening? We have some great technology coming out in the world at this point of time. But do you see in terms of green energy, the US moving first, Europe going first, Asia? Then I would want you to talk about India as well a little bit, please. Do you think India would move into this direction?
So if you would have asked me that question in June of 2022, I would have said, no question, hands down, the Europeans are moving faster. They've got a hydrogen backbone strategy to build dedicated hydrogen pipelines and connect the whole of the EU and into the Nordics, and to the UK as well. So significant money, significant mind share was in place in June in the EU. That's still there, and it's still going at the same tempo. But then an unexpected thing happened, which was the US woke up in July. And I don't ask me why or how or what made things flip, but the Inflation Reduction Act and the incentives carved out for hydrogen are extraordinary. And they immediately, for at least the next decade, put projects that were on the margin in the money. So now everybody is piling into the US to find a path to very large gigawatt scale renewable projects, which are also incentivized in the Inflation Reduction Act, plus hydrogen projects that couple with those renewables. So it is an absolute incentive-driven gold rush as we sit here today. And there's not enough supply of anything to be able to satisfy the demand that was created in the month of July by a stroke of a pen. And that's fantastic.
It is fantastic. I mean, I remember this. I think the energy secretary, I think his name is David Turk. I think he thinks it's very versatile. He thinks clean energy is a high priority for the US administration, of course. And you were absolutely right. I mean, the US is always known to produce gray hydrogen, right? But the sudden shift is amazing. I'm glad you called it out there. And why do you think that happened? Is it because of energy sustainability, or is it just because they see this as a viable option to go green? And it's very interesting. And the US, for the last 8 years at least, has not been very supportive of the green energy movement, right? Very interesting.
No, I think it's directly at the heart of delivering on climate change solutions, and more importantly, painting a picture of economic prosperity at the same time. So I'll get on a soapbox for a second, but the number of people that threw stones at solar 15 years ago were many. And then the same stone throwers are long gone. You don't hear about them anymore. They're eagerly building tens of gigawatts of their own projects to replace other alternatives that they had in the marketplace because they're making money at it. And they figured out that better just to keep quiet and go green, but not green for decarbonization's sake, green for their bottom line. And they are going big in that realm. The flip side of that is they've learned from that experience, and they've said, we know what happens when you can catalyze scale. When you can kick that scale up, the cost can come down 80% in 10 years. We just saw it happen. So it'll happen again in hydrogen. And then you go, okay, if you can participate in a once in a generation transition on energy, you don't have to own assets at the bottom of the Gulf, or you don't have to drill offshore. I mean, this is a pretty egalitarian move on the energy transition side. The access to sun and wind is fairly universal. So many different players that are not traditional companies can get into this and make significant money, to include all the people that have a stake in building out pipelines and distribution systems and storage or transport. It's basically a cascading effect of economic benefit. And there's every manner of participation that can be green for monetary purposes and green for decarbonization. You don't have to choose between the two. They're good for each other.
Yeah.
The US and the EU definitely are top of the heap in terms of throwing incentives at where to go and what to do. But there are two other markets that have moved massively in the direction of renewables and green hydrogen, and that's India and Australia. Now, their incentives are less mature, if you will, but their demand is equal to or greater than that of the US or the EU, which is stunning. 4 countries could make hundreds of gigawatts of difference immediately.
Okay, I just want to stick with the US for a couple of minutes maybe, and come back to the US once again. Come back to India, pardon me. I've been reading this news, right? And you guys, I mean, in the US, I don't know if the Department of Energy has reached out to you. Apparently, there has been an announcement of 7 billion in funding opportunity for, storage hubs, or these energy hubs, as you call it, for green hydrogen. And it's all at this point of time conjecture. At this point of time, we don't know whether it's going to really happen, but there are big targets that have been created, right? 20 million metric tons of green hydrogen by 2040, and perhaps 50 million by 2050. It's interesting that the US is looking very progressive suddenly, all of a sudden. And when I look at India and look at the incentives that we've given to solar, and now solar has gone from 15 rupees per unit, or when I say 15 rupees, it's still very cheap in American standard. It's probably about 30 cents or something, to, it's come down to 4 rupees, which is really prohibitively cheap. It's about 5 cents or something like that, right? So how does that translate into India using green hydrogen? I'm trying to figure out your India strategy at this point in time. Are you going to work with partners? I know you will give the technology on a royalty basis or a partnership basis, right? So how do you see India use solar? Because that's the biggest renewable energy that we've had at this point in time. Yes, we've had water as a resource, and there's wind also, but solar has taken the cake here. Have you looked at the Indian market in detail?
Through partnerships. And when I say in detail, we're looking through them to what they're seeing. So clearly there are very large integrated players that have renewables. In some cases, they have transmission and distribution and renewables. They're missing a piece in the middle called electrolyzers. And then they have ambitions to convert, let's say, photons into molecules. And okay, there's some enabling technology, and we feel like we would be a very good partner to unlock that last step in the value chain that links from renewable generation to portable molecules, let's put it that way. And if you have, let's say, integrated ports as part of your offering, and you've got the capability to work with international distributors of energy, like an oil and gas major, it's easy to imagine taking your solar assets and converting them to, let's say, green ammonia that could be transported to other parts of the world. So you could become a net energy exporter of the sun, which is bonkers if you think about that. Like that hasn't been contemplated before. So you used to think we can only use our renewables in India. Well, now you can export your renewables through molecules and send them elsewhere. So I perceive India to be a very large net exporter of energy in their future, which is really quite profound as a shift from where India is today on their overall energy independence strategy, if you will.
I like what you're saying. It's versatile as an energy resource. You're saying it can be transformed into electricity or synthetic gas or any other type of energy, like ammonia, right? You said green ammonia, right?
Yeah.
And you use it for commercial and industrial purposes. But how would they? I mean, it's interesting, right? You're saying we can become an exporter of an energy resource now.
I think that India is rich enough in sun and wind
Yeah.
that you won't be able to consume it all domestically, and there will likely be a profit-making activity for export. And because of some of the other factor costs of being able to integrate from renewable to port, I think you may have some of the cheapest molecules on the planet
Yeah.
as things progress, which then becomes like now you're a differentiated commodity producer, which opens the door to all kinds of wealth creation domestically or internationally.
And the transportation has to happen to pipes, or is it containers? How does that work when you
My
transport?
understanding is it goes into, they're like, they're vessels that go on a ship. You
Yeah.
could, it's
Yeah.
basically like a bunker.
Got
They
it.
look like an onion to me, like these onions that go inside of a
Yeah.
container ship.
Yeah.
But I think that's very akin to what they do today for ammonia transport and or other chemicals, if you will.
Yeah, and it's easy to store. Obviously, that's the whole point. So it's
Yeah.
100% sustainable, storable, and versatile.
Yep.
I just want to talk about the electrolyzer that you have. I mean, I have not. The damn COVID does not let me travel. Perhaps next year I'm going to come to the US and I'm going to spend time in your office and get to see the technology in hand. Most of them will now, all the software guys will say, "Oh, is that a software?" It's definitely not a software. It is something else. Do you want to tell? Is the electrolyzer a big device, or how does that work?
It's a big device. So think about it as like a big rectangle that has, let's just say, a 3-inch deep anode on one side with some metal architecture on the inside that encourages circulation and current distribution and gas separation, if you will. Then there's a membrane in the middle and a mirror image cathode on the other side. So taken together, they look like, let's call it, for lack of a better term, 4 or 5-inch thick electrochemical cells that circulate potassium hydroxide at the bottom. It separates, that's the electrolyte. The membrane separates the hydrogen and the oxygen. Those go different directions. And then you take a number of those cells and you put them in a stack. And a stack just means you're making electrical contact. Imagine a 3-meter squared cell is standing on edge and there's a neighbor right next to it, and then another and another and another, like a deck of cards, except with 160 cells. And that's 20 megawatts of hydrogen production capability. 20 megawatts would be like 8 tons a day of
Yeah,
hydrogen.
and it doesn't
So
take so much space as well, right? I mean, it's
no,
how
that's
many
right.
of these do I have to pack to have say a 20 megawatt plant or something? I mean, does it take X amount of
In,
square feet?
in our example, it would be, let's say, less than 70,000 square feet of a plant gets you
Okay.
200,000, 200 megawatts.
Wow, that's
So that's
large. That's
80
nice.
tons a day of hydrogen could
Mm,
be produced in a 70,000 square foot building.
mhm.
So you're not talking, and by the way, these are plants that you should think of as eat for us. Each one of our cells is digital. It does
Yeah,
have the capability to talk,
yeah,
and it gives you a voltage signal off the anode and the cathode, which we then turn into algorithms to say, dear cell, how are you performing today? How can we help you? And there is a digital twin available, put it that way, when you build an entire plant. Now, a plant is not run by hundreds of operators. A plant is capable of autonomous operations. And then the operators intervene when there's a maintenance
yeah,
cycle.
yeah,
They're not required to attend to the machines. The machines run 24/7 as directed by a control system. So you can imagine a control room of a handful of people and then an operations and maintenance room that has another handful of people. And that's what it takes to be producing 80 tons a day.
Marty, so you'd probably have channel partners who would implement all this in a plant. 70,000 square feet of space. Some partner would come and set it up. Are there experts to set up green hydrogen?
There are several, and think about the engineering, procurement, and construction
EPC
industry.
companies. Yeah.
They've been building chloralkali plants for decades. It looks and feels just like a chloralkali plant, except simpler, safer, and easier. So this is going to go really, really fast. Trust me on this. Like,
yeah,
the scalability of the platform that we're using, and to a lesser degree others, but it's going to be extraordinarily scalable and fast.
Okay.
And I think people that are watching today will hear green hydrogen and they'll say, yeah, first time I heard about it was, whatever, October. They won't stop hearing about it. And 10 years hence, they'll say, I don't even remember how this started, but all of a sudden it's ubiquitous and it's everywhere.
I'm going to go back to automobile because that's where I feel the safest. Say I have a 600-acre plant, say a large plant like perhaps a Toyota or one of these companies like Volkswagen maybe.
Yeah.
And I have solar. I implement solar. What does it take me? What's the energy cost for me? There's one capex investment where I get the electrolyzers as a stack, right? And I want to generate my own power capacity. We can go up to 500 megawatt or something. If you go to the Volkswagen plant in Wolfsburg, Germany, they have their own power plant. You're typically saying I can replace the damn thing.
Yeah.
Right?
So if I understand your question, the way to think about, like, are you speaking specifically about India or other markets?
All markets, actually.
Okay, so, well, I'll start with India because I think it has some inherent advantages. Yeah. So in India, you can imagine producing or building your own solar power plant anywhere in the country and being able to bank that renewable energy and use it elsewhere for electrolysis. So they don't need to necessarily be co-located when you have grid enablement like India does. Now there are charges, and yes, you have to move things around, and banking has its own particulars, but that's about as frictionless as it gets as an entity, as a country. Now the US has multiple service regions and they don't all behave the same way. So you have to treat Texas as one country and the Northeast as another set of countries. And so you've got some peculiar things that you have to do in, like, the US. You also have to find opportunities to co-locate. If you want to get a real bang, being able to co-locate renewables and its direct partner downstream, you can cut out a whole bunch of intermediate steps for inverting and transmitting and distributing. You can cut out a bunch of those costs and direct couple renewables straight into an electrolysis plant with a small amount of electrical gear. And now you've got the capability to take your own independent power, if you chose to do it that way, and create your own green energy on the other side in the form of a molecule. And I think
which I can then share with other companies out there for profit, right, or I can give back to the grid. Right.
Going back to your hub example, you also could be, let's say that in Texas, you could find renewables that you wanted to couple with. And as the hub evolves, you would be able to electrolyze and put your green hydrogen into a pipeline where demand is federated, okay? And offtake pricing is set by a hub price. And as an electrolyzer company partnering with renewables, you could produce your green hydrogen, pipeline it, and sell to the open market at hub pricing, which kind of flattens a whole bunch of different energy paradigms all at the same time. That same capability is happening in other places like Northwestern Germany, they have what they call non-discriminatory access to pipelines, hydrogen dedicated pipelines. So you're going to start seeing electrolysis companies and renewable providers pairing up in ecosystems, producing green hydrogen in a pipeline system and selling at a hub. And then off-takers could be anybody that could come and buy hydrogen on hub pricing contracts and withdraw, if you will, green hydrogen.
Yeah. It's, I want to ask you some difficult questions now. There'll be guys watching this will say, hey, it's high cost, there's high energy consumption to do green hydrogen and things like that. And then they may even say it's highly volatile and flammable as an element, and there have to be extreme safety measures, right? Your thoughts on all of this? Let's go by one. High cost. You're saying costs will drop as things scale, right? What is the cost at this point of time in the US in terms of dollars per unit or whatever?
Yeah, there's a whole bunch of caveats in this. So let's say if you're taking our technology and you're partnering with intermittent renewable power that is on a historic price of solar or wind, that's less than $3 a kilo to produce. Okay. That's with our approach. Let's say that there are maybe a little bit more expensive approaches out there based on the CapEx that they're using in their approach. But let's just say for argument's sake that you could economically produce hydrogen in the US almost ubiquitously less than $5 a kilo. And if you can do so on green energy, let's say that drops the price a bit more. Now, add in an investment tax or a production tax credit of $3 a kilo for green production, you're now solidly in the money against any other form out there. And that's before scale hits and before technology gets really started. My personal opinion and where this is going is there's no reason that we couldn't electrolyze below $2 a kilo as we sit today at scale without incentives. Now add incentives, that's a business. That's a very interesting business. And we're going to make friends with all kinds of renewables providers and figure out how to share those ecosystem results.
Okay, what about high energy consumption? They say production of green hydrogen, is particularly requires more energy. When they say more energy, what do the critics mean by more energy? You must have come across these questions. Does it take a lot of energy to produce green hydrogen?
That's a relative to what question. And so if you say relative to producing gray hydrogen and using natural gas, well, what?
Yeah, I get the point now.
Yep. So let's just say that in the land of using existing low cost natural gas in the US, which is not as low cost as it once was, okay, that comes with some, let's say, costs that are not fully embedded in the molecule price. And those are transferred to the commons, if you will. Like I'm paying for the air quality of the CO2 emissions as a citizen of the US. And we're just absorbing all of that exogenous variables of CO2 and climate destruction as if it doesn't have a real cost. We just say, well, at a BTU level, natural gas is cheaper than if you electrolyze using solar or wind. Well, maybe, until you take the full life cycle costs into account and you account for all the deleterious effects that also go along with it. Okay, now take natural gas pricing today as we sit. Well, things are different. We're not at $3 an MMBTU anymore. We're at different pricing. And now all of a sudden, solar and wind are economically cheaper than their gray counterpart with none of the environmental constraints. So, okay, will natural gas get back to $3? Maybe. That's a historical low that's ever been demonstrated on the planet. Will it get to that point again? Maybe. Maybe.
Maybe for a short while. maybe before it just goes off in a whimper.
It kind of feels like people have woken up to the fact that the free ride of CO2 is not acceptable. It actually has to be accounted for. And I'm not saying that we've got a carbon cap and trading system or anything else where we've got any kind of policy in that regard, but it's taking shape that the incentives, not the punishments, but the incentives are leading people down the path of decarbonization, and the economics will follow. And then it becomes a self-interested a flywheel of goodness, if you will. And you won't have to have the debate about what's cheaper. It'll be, well, why would you produce 10 times more CO2 than you otherwise have to? It's cheaper and more profitable to do it this way than that way. And you don't have the negative effects on the environment.
Okay. And what about the safety issues?
Safety, as I mentioned,
it's volatile and flammable, right?
And it's been around for decades and decades and decades. You don't see news reports of petrochemical companies or industrial chemical companies or chlorine companies in the news every day saying, oh my gosh, we had a hydrogen issue. It's a very rare event, very, very rare. Additionally, there are hydrogen transport containers on the roads in every country in the world and have been for decades. You don't read about, oh my gosh, there was a traffic accident and a hydrogen tanker truck blew up and blew a whole city up. Like that, it's just not there. So safety is proven for decades at this point. You would have more luck finding environmental calamities or safety issues around drilling operations than you would probably hydrogen transport, for example.
Got it. Wonderful answer. I want you to tell me about its applications. Perhaps you think this can be used in space because storage is easy. And what are some of the applications are there? I know you don't want to talk about automobile cars getting into hydrogen, because that's a whole different topic. But you mentioned that diesel trucks would go away. You did mention that, right? So I want to know a couple of things. Space applications, where you can probably, you can have clean drinking water for people there in space or something of that sort through all that. What are some of the applications, out of the world applications that you see in storage and space missions?
Yeah, so before we get to space, let's try the next intermediate part of the atmosphere and say air. So there is a massive push to do sustainable aviation fuels, which would be hydrogen. In that's a use case that is coming to fore really, really quickly. Now, you can imagine it takes a little bit of confidence building for all the previous questions you just asked around safety to say, okay, everyone, we're going to fly a hydrogen powered plane, but that's coming. At the end of the day, you can definitely imagine, I'm off the top of my head, I think hydrogen is as light as you can get and as dense as you can get as an energy carrier if you compress it well enough. So I think sustainable aviation fuel is coming. And I think some very, very large players, let's just say people like, I don't know, Airbus or, whatever,
any airline company, anybody, Boeing, Airbus, maybe,
Boeing, that's
or NASA, maybe even,
It's definitely capable of sustainable aviation fuel in air travel. Space, I don't know. That's beyond my intellectual.
That's our science fiction. We'll leave it to our readers or viewers to come and tell us, what they think about, green hydrogen in space. But it's interesting.
I do think you're going to see hydrogen air travel rather soon. I think there are commercially capable planes that can do it. Confidence level of consumers, that's a different story. That's going to take a bit more time.
Okay. Tell us a little bit about your team and also about yourself. What draws you to clean energy, and why do you want to do this? And a lot of the clean energy conversations come out of Boston and California, of course, but never in the center of the US. It's very different. It's always in the coast. So I wanted your thoughts. Your team first. Let's start with team. Let's talk about yourself a little bit and why we are so split in the clean energy conversation around the world.
Yeah, so the team for me was awesome. Like I said, I was the last employee in of a spin out. So day one, we created a name and we spun out of this other company, Chemistry, with investment dollars and assets and a fully realized team that had been working together for 8 to 13 years. That some of them have been together for 13 years, some for 8. So in that regard, it's really interesting to have a startup where you don't go from like 2 or 3 founders and then expand. It was very different for me to join a mature team that already had ways of working. They already had a culture. They already had interpersonal dynamics and everything kind of sorted. So what I ended up doing when I first joined was, instead of saying, this is what I want the culture to be, I observed the culture for, let's say, the first quarter. And then I codified that into our culture map, if you will. And I just basically held up a mirror to a team that had been working together a long time. And culture, of course, in a startup is critical. What you get right at your culture at the earliest outset is what you replicate as you expand. So we had to get that part right, but that wasn't my design. It was my observation of a team in action and then documenting, if you will, the culture of the company as a way of working. And so that's working really, really well. We've now doubled in size in terms of headcount and number of employees, and we're using that same center of gravity as a culture to replicate. And we hire, we screen, we socialize, we dimension, if you will, everything kind of on that same cultural skew that we started with, and it's working. Now, me personally,
Yeah, why green energy? And do you come from the long history of being in green energy industry, or Marty? You have to tell me.
No, I spent, let's call it 20 years in contract manufacturing at every size and scale of every one of the contract manufacturers you've ever heard of. The last role I had was COO of Flex. So, I had hundreds of factories in tens of countries and about 160,000 employees in my organization. So I had been involved in manufacturing of all kinds all over the globe for quite some time. Now I got to the logical limits of what else I could do. And then I also had my own version of like a midlife crisis, if you will, where you go, am I doing what needs to be done, or am I just producing more widgets that are ending up in landfills year after year after year? Am I part of the solution? Am I part of the problem? And so when I did a little reflection on that, it was right around the same time that solar was coming into its own. And I was like, okay, I did that for this amount of time. This time, instead of pointing fingers at environmental issues and saying, why doesn't somebody go do something? Well, why don't I just put my money where my mouth is and just see if I can do something and contribute? So in 2007, I jumped ship in earnest and went renewables and said, okay, what can I do to personally contribute and make a living? Like, there's not a comma that says not for profit Marty. That's not me. I'm a for-profit individual because I think it's the best engine for transformation is to appeal to self-interest economically, and you can get a lot done if you can do that.
I would second that. I mean, that's the incentive as well, right? You can build technologies that change the world, make impact, and make money in the process. And I'm so happy for you and your team. And I really wish you guys go on to do some wonderful things with your electrolyzer. So what I could expect is, you told me your 200 megawatt plants that can come about, and maybe a company that's setting it up maybe need what, about 10 to 15 electrolyzers per plant. How many would they need?
Yeah, 200 megawatts for us is 10 electrolyzers.
Okay,
Yeah.
that's interesting. So for that, if you're an Indian company, you have to seek financing, or would you have help in terms of financing this kind of a project within India? This is a very India-specific question, Marty. Would you see them working with financial partners like PE companies coming and doing special purpose vehicles to do this? Or would Verdagy also upfront investment as it grows with its partners in India or any part of the world?
Yeah, if you think about it, it's very much like project development in solar
Yeah,
or wind.
yeah,
If you can start on one end with a renewable contract where you
yeah,
know you can build a renewable plant of substance and you know what the output of that plant is going to be, and you know on the other end that there's an off-taker for
yes,
whatever is produced, those two contracts in hand, taken to a financier to intermediate,
hmm,
can get you everything else to connect the whole
got it.
ecosystem.
Got it.
And
So a
you
lot
see
of the
that play
renewable
out again and
energy
again.
EPC companies, a lot of the EPC companies can get this technology going in countries like India,
That's
right?
right.
Right. Do you
Absolutely.
see
Absolutely
large
right.
companies just saying that, look, I'm going to do it myself because I have everything in house, but I can
Of
use,
course.
yeah, they
Yeah,
can do that too.
of
Okay.
course.
Okay. Marty, this has been a wonderful conversation, but I can't let you go because you're the CEO, and I definitely want to pick your brains on what are you reading at this point of time? What are books that have influenced you? I know maybe being a CEO busy and you've not read recently, maybe, but you could tell me if you're reading anything now and what has influenced you in your life? Any books, authors? It can be painters, actors as well, actresses as well, or
Yeah.
it can be family too. Over to you.
Yeah. So the one book that basically got me on a journey of sustainability was a book. Somebody handed it to me my first day at SunPower when I started there as a solar COO. And I put it on a shelf. It found me years later, and then I read it. And it's a book by Ray Anderson called Confessions of a Radical Industrialist. And he was the CEO of a company, Interface, which makes carpet. And he transformed his company. He was the founder and owner of the company, and he transformed the company. And he wrote a book about it. So I read that book, and I was like, okay, this is so pragmatic. There's an entire recipe for what he did over a 20-year journey. That's all it takes. Just get started, do a 20-year journey. So we started there at SunPower, and that was on the sustainability side. And then on the personal side, I just picked up a book, and I can't remember the title, but it's by Thich Nhat Hanh, the
Mhm.
Buddhist monk, and it's
Okay.
how to save the planet, if you will. But it starts from, and I'm just starting, but it starts from a mindfulness and meditation practice. And it basically, the upshot from what I can tell is, if you want to save the world, you start internal to yourself. And so that's a good, it's a good thing to read when you start thinking too big or too
Yeah.
overwhelming. You start where
Yeah.
you can, which is inside yourself.
Okay. As a CEO, how important is mindfulness to you? Because this is the week of mental peace too. A lot of kids today struggle with mental peace, with the way, like you said, you are either part of a solution or part of the problem. A lot of the kids are getting caught, they become part of the problem. And, mindfulness, mental peace is becoming very important. Do you think that's something that young people lack today because of the amount of information that's out there, and it's so confusing to do what is appropriate? And I don't know what is appropriate. There's so much information, right?
Yeah. And so, first of all, I think it's extraordinarily important. And let's just say that mindfulness, or the ability to have a quiet, reflective moment, eludes probably 99% of the population. And it's not getting better with the digital environment surrounding them. So that's going to be something that people have to actively choose to change. And when and if they do, then I think they can go inward and have a much more healthy relationship with themselves, which will manifest with a healthier relationship to the outside world. But it starts by really looking inside and looking deeply inside, but you have to have some quiet to do that. And quiet is, just go to a restaurant. You can't see a single person that doesn't stare at a little screen.
Yeah.
It used to be that you would people watch at a restaurant.
Yeah.
And you'd have a thought by yourself. Not anymore. So I'm hopeful that people will have the opportunity to spend some time just with themselves, however much time they can afford in a day, whatever they can turn into a practice, whether it's 30 seconds, it doesn't matter, as long as you start and you commit to that mindfulness practice. It'll grow through time like any other habit, but it has to start. And I think that's a key to a lot of healing for a lot of people that are suffering from, let's just call it an overwhelming amount of digital stimulation.
It's brilliantly said, actually. You meant it. I mean, and I think I would second you on that one. I think the book you perhaps recommended was At Home in the World, Stories and Essential Teachings from a Monk's Life. Is that the one?
Yep.
Yeah, right. And the other one was Confessions of a Rational Industrialist.
Radical
industrialist. Yeah. So thank you so much, Marty. And it's me, it's been mindful to talk about green hydrogen and its applications. And I hope we see a greener world. And I really believe that we need to get this act going very fast. And I hope any private equity fund watching this, or any VC fund watching this, anybody interested in green hydrogen, write to me and I'll get Marty to answer your questions. Right. Perfect. I'll connect you to Marty. What's important for me is that, going green is not a movement. We got to do it. We see how weathers are changing globally, crops being affected. Sometimes you can see that with how, the availability of food shortages are becoming real because of weather. I hope things change soon. And, if you enjoyed this podcast, you share it with your friends. And anyway, you want to connect with Marty, just write to The Upstream Life and I will connect you to Marty. It's Vishal at theupstreamlife.com. Thank you so much, Marty, for being on the podcast. I'll see you in, California real soon. Thank you.
Perfect. Thanks, Vishal.